I'm so excited to introduce our panel and our guests for this conversation. Eric Roper and Melissa Townsend created and produced the Ghost of a Chance podcast from the Minnesota Star Tribune. There was an expansive feature also in the paper, so if you haven't seen this, you can grab one on the way back. But this is a special section that they printed when this came out in print version as well. So Paul is in the back there holding a copy, so you can grab a copy. So let's welcome them. Eric and Melissa, thank you for being here. And Adair Mosley is CEO of the Groundbreak Coalition. The work of Groundbreak, I should say, has an important connection to the subject of this podcast, which we're going to get into. And if you have a question, we have two of my colleagues during this conversation who will be roving with microphones. Christine has a microphone. Paul at some point will have a microphone. But sometimes you're at these events and they wait till the very end for questions. I don't like doing that because sometimes the question you want to ask, we've moved on. So flag them down. I like to do it in real time. So if you have a question, kind of look for Christine and Paul and raise your hand and we'll try to get your question in. So for those who haven't listened, other than the little blurb we just heard, and I do encourage you, by the way, to one of the people who was here was talking to me and says, I'm someone who listens to a lot of podcasts. And as someone who listens to a lot of podcasts, I give this 2 thumbs up. So we have one letter of recommendation for this podcast. But this is a story that is centered around the story and the home where Eric lives. So my first question is whether you are expensing your mortgage payments at the Star Tribune.
No.
But really set this up for it. Eric, start with the house and how we got into this and the project, kind of an overview.
So I live in the Kingfield neighborhood in Minneapolis. We don't say it on the podcast, but it's on 39th and Pleasant. So people in this crowd, actually this is going to YouTube. Anyway, whatever, it's fine. And I live in the Kingfield area, and I moved in March of 2020. And soon discovered actually a map from Mapping Prejudice. It wasn't a map of covenants, which is what they're usually known for, but it was a map of a wave of black families who lived in southwest Minneapolis in the early 20th century. And my home was on the map, and it mentioned, Harry and Clementine Robinson. It was sort of a blurb on the map. And I reached out to Kirsten and Penny, who I already knew at Mapping Prejudice, and said, my home is on this map that you produced. And they said, oh, you moved into the Robinson house. And they had sort of a one-pager on it that they had some materials that they had done in creating that map. This was March of 2020. Suddenly I was going to have a lot of time on my hands in the pandemic and things like this. And I'm also like a clinically obsessive person. And so I realized that there was something to me that was interesting here, but I didn't know at that time quite how lengthy and sort of expansive this would become. But so that's kind of how it began, I guess. Yeah.
And then at some point, Melissa, you came into the picture because the short version of the story is that you weren't sure if this was ever going to be a story, then it became a story, and then there was the question of whether to make it a podcast. So just talk about how you joined the project there and what you had to work with when you started.
Yeah, thanks for having us. So I was called in just to talk to Eric, I think, and the team. And Eric and I sat down for hours, over weeks, I think, and he told me everything he had found over 4 years of research. And I'll tell you this other aside. We were talking to some reporters in the Netherlands today. They reached out. They love the podcast. They want to do something similar. And I showed them Eric's historical timeline, and it's all cited and all the links are there, and their eyes popped out of their heads. They were like, this is really overwhelming. So it was a ton of research. And then the question was like, how do we craft this into a narrative that's cohesive? And where is their tape? Eric's an incredible reporter and also a print reporter. So I remember this one conversation we had where he was like, well, I know it. And I was like, it's not enough if you know it. I need tape. We need a recording. So we ended up doing a lot more interviews and things together and then piecing it together after that.
And now you're big in the Netherlands, so now we know. Harry and Clementine Robinson found their way to Minnesota. And Eric, I gather that it was in theory because Minnesota was more tolerant of black people, or was that maybe just the impression?
I mean, I think we talk about this in the podcast. I think, with Clementine leaving Kansas City around the first decade of the 20th century, Kansas City is a very segregated place. There's a long history there. And I think there was an idea about Minnesota. It didn't have explicit Jim Crow laws and these things. But once you arrive, I think what we talk about in the podcast is that there's extensive employment discrimination, housing discrimination. A lot of it is happening through these sort of private transactional things. So it's hard to say exactly what they thought of Minnesota, but it is sort of this most northernmost place at a time when Clementine is, leaving, especially in Kansas City, leaving sort of a very segregated place. So, and we talk about whether they may have been surprised when they got here. So.
Yeah, there is an oral history by a woman named Ethel Nance who grew up in Duluth. I think she was a child in 1905 in Duluth. Gosh, okay, these details. And she talks about how her father would do trips through the South and tell black folks, come to Minnesota. And she says in this oral history, like, they don't want you there, but you'll get a fair trial, right? So, mixed bag.
Adair, as you dived into this podcast, what came to mind, especially you have this role that you're in is new, but the work you're doing is not new, right? And so, how did you think about? I don't know where your work life and your personal life blended as you were listening to this podcast.
So my initial kind of, I think, overall reaction to this is that, what if we all thought about the history of something and the caretaking that is necessary, and then to steward it in a way that often, uncovers its truth, uncovers its meaning and utility. And I think that we're oftentimes coming in. So I think that was it was out of deep reverence, really, for your like passion and ability to continue to pull that thread and wanting to know that history and allowing the rest of us to see that story and bring us into your living room. And that history is one, we certainly often talk about the Rondo neighborhood because that is one of the places that disrupted Black wealth. But Kingfield, because of 35 and the Black families that live there, or families across America, Black families across America that have lost their home or not been able to continue that legacy. So my overall, thought about this entire podcast is not only the rich storytelling, but just a deep appreciation for the care to be able to uncover that story.
The Mapping Prejudice organization that you referenced, excuse me, in my estimation, even before I listened to the podcast and read your story, really seems to have done something really important for the understanding of history here in the last decade. And one of them is through this mapping of which houses in the Twin Cities have these covenants that is language in your deeds, no longer enforceable, but say that someday when you sell this, you can't sell it to a Black person, and then there's usually a list of other people you can't sell it to. But it also uncovers this history, Eric, of this moment. So Minneapolis becomes a city in the 1870s. And then there is this moment in the early 1900s when Black families were able to locate pretty much anywhere. Like, there was some grouping, and maybe that was self-grouping or whatever, but there really was this moment where Black families were moving in to Minneapolis. And then by the 40s, they were all gone, except for what we now know and think of as the redlining areas of the city. What happened?
I mean, I think, so when we think about covenants are associated with the deed of a home, and covenants didn't come into widespread use, and I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but until like after World War I. And, my home was built in 1907. These properties were platted in that first decade of the 1900s. So neighbors in those areas, the covenants weren't an option. And so what we learned early on, or what I learned early on in working on this, was about the protest meeting in 1920 about how to oust Black residents from Southwest Minneapolis. And at the time, my research indicates there were roughly 9 of those families at that time. They said fewer than a dozen. And I think the protest meeting, and I've done a lot of work trying to understand the people behind the meeting, but it's like, covenants were sort of, I think Kirsten talks in the podcast about covenants being sort of the answer to the protest meeting, the sort of, you don't have to do the protest meeting. You can just tuck this thing into your deed. The protest meeting is sort of the uglier, more explicit racism on display, which briefly then gets articles written in the Tribune at that time, which I think for every one of these that we know about, there are many that we don't know about. So it's kind of amazing that it was written about in the paper. But 200 people came together 5 blocks from my house seeking to oust black residents from Southwest Minneapolis. So now I forgot your question, but they were the ones that clued me into that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and Adair, I mean, it also speaks to what I've taken from Mapping Prejudice, and I have a lived experience that doesn't have it, in my ancestry, that this would be a story told down through the ages, but that the remove, like, it for me as a kind of data person, it shows how systemic and purposeful it was. It wasn't a random thing that black families just suddenly, oh, you know what, by the 40s, we're just going to go live somewhere else. And that it was systemic.
And I think, our history has taught us that while we may have abolished things like slavery, that it showed up in the policies and practices that actually marginalize and continue to disenfranchise black families. And if you, with that same work of the Mapping Prejudice, if you look at the maps in North Minneapolis, which is, black families being redlined to the area where it was high industrial, and the map saying slum and Negroes on it. And so these things have been deeply entrenched into our systems, and then they've manifested. They've continued to manifest. They live today in the allocation of resources around our education and in the quality of our schools. And so they continue to play out in the 21st century.
Yeah. I come across I did a research project myself about some of this, and I came across a quote from Dick Gregory, the satirist, very well known in the 60s. And Dick Gregory said, "In the South, they don't mind how close I get so long as I don't get too big. In the North, they don't mind how big I get as long as I don't get too close." And I think that maybe, Melissa, goes to the earlier point about why I even come to Minnesota, and that the impression was maybe it would be better, but it was just a different kind of discrimination.
Yeah, and as we're talking about Mapping Prejudice, in making the podcast and working with Eric, I really felt like I was a witness to how people's unconscious bias, racism, discrimination then got codified into the way we live and the way we think about the world. And one of the ways I think about all the time is like concern about your property value. And so it was around the time, 1924 roughly, where, and Kirsten Delegar from Mapping Prejudice calls this junk science, where they were like, if you have one black family in your neighborhood, your property value will go down this much. And now you are starting to threaten people's life savings that they put in their home, their nest egg that they're saving for their retirement, because you're tying racism with people's savings and with people's livelihood, basically. And then that becomes part of how we think about real estate.
That gets into a little bit of the work you're doing now. Adair, talk about that, draw that line. I mean, what we're talking about here with the work that Eric did to research his house. I mean, we're talking about a family that lost the ability to build wealth.
So my work is really, I think, reclamation of what you all have described. It is about a reclaiming and an ability to be able to build black wealth, what has been extracted and taken from, and an opportunity for us to really right a wrong. And wanting to draw in allies and co-conspirators and those who really want to do that. And so the Groundbreak Coalition is what I've been describing as a legacy building movement, because it's our region's big bet on closing the racial wealth gaps. And one of those ways in which we're doing that is through home ownership. Because we know that wealth is built, one of the ways in which wealth is built is through owning a home and passing that down through generations. We're also focusing on small business entrepreneurship and then the development of place through commercial real estate. But particularly around home ownership, what we've uncovered is that we share the dreams and aspirations of wanting to provide a safe place for our families to live in a thriving community, but that has not been equally shared across our community. And so this is an opportunity to bring 11,000, over the next decade, 11,000 Black households into the space of ownership. And so it's bold, it's ambitious. And the ways in which we're doing that is by having access to down payment assistance dollars. And that those dollars and our dollars are extremely flexible. We're giving up to $50,000 to actually then allow and equip Black households to be able to go out and get a home anywhere in the 7-county metro, and seeing some early successes to that. I'll pause right there before I start to explain all the program.
Start going all through it. Well, but what Groundbreak, and we'll kind of fast forward for a moment, because Groundbreak was born from the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, in some ways, in earnest, right? But there were already efforts happening of, we got to find ways to help build wealth. What's different? It seems like for decades and generations, even if people were trying, it wasn't really making a dent. What do you think's happening that might be different here with this?
I think one of Groundbreak is, so it's $5.4 billion over 10 years that we're trying to catalyze across those areas. And so one of it is that the solution is at the scale of the challenge. And so I think that is different. No more thinking in incrementalism. It's really about how do we take leaps against these really entrenched disparities that are right here in our own backyard. So that's one big difference. The other is that all this work, all the things that power the kind of movement building work that we're describing, requires the coalition of the willing. And so a big piece of this is about bringing the institutions together, bringing leaders together. It was born out of the vision of Tanya Allen, who's the president of the McKnight Foundation, and then using that platform, using that power to then bring other institutions along board, like the Minneapolis Foundation, like the Bush Foundation, to say, we have to go at this together. And if we don't go at together, then we're only going to incrementally make progress on something that we've been really, really churning at. And so I think that is one of the, yes, it's about deploying big capital, but it's really about individuals who deeply see liberation linked and tied not only from people to people, but from institution to institution. Is that a sign? Oh, sorry. That's one of the big differences.
Reclaim your time, Adair.
Yeah.
That's what
No.
Yeah. But Eric, your own timeline, it just so happens, right? You had bought the house a few months, I believe, or maybe up to a year before George Floyd.
Couple
months, and that was not far from where you lived. How did that live in you as you were doing this? You weren't baking bread during COVID like some folks were. You were doing this research project, but how did those two things show up in your life after George Floyd was murdered?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a little bit in the podcast, how as a journalist in the aftermath of that, I think there was a lot of, societally, there was a lot of urgency to post something on social media or to be an advocate. And I guess I felt a little awkward in that role as a journalist. And I don't think I had given enough thought to these issues also. And here I had in front of me something that I didn't know what it would turn into, but it felt like this was a road that could be promising, that could teach me something about, because it did feel to me in that period like there was sort of a bit of a grasping about what is the history of race in Minneapolis. And there were obviously resources already available. Mapping Prejudice was already out there. Sometimes it's, we all need our own avenues into a topic, I think. And so for me, frankly, this was a private project of mine for 3 years before I told an editor at the Star Tribune about what I was working on, because I didn't know what it was. I just knew that this was something interesting. And, I was like using my personal email, and I just didn't know that I was working. To me, this was sort of my personal project. And over time, I started to realize that the Robinsons' lives, and specifically the locations and time periods where they are living in South Minneapolis, were very important, not only to teach us about the protest meetings and racism in Kingfield in the 20s, which we know continued in the 30s and beyond, but then into the creation of the Old South Side, this black middle class neighborhood at 38th and 4th Avenue. They moved there right as it's really starting to develop. And then their last location is one house off of what would become 35W. And we know that Clementine, and I now literally know this because I've met someone who told me she sat on her front stoop. She literally watched the wall be constructed between her old neighborhood and her new neighborhood. And so it took years to sort of put that together, but there's something very interesting to me about where they were and when they were there to teach us a story about South Minneapolis that I hadn't heard in that way before.
And was that, you said Clementine saw the wall being built, or this person that you visited with saw the wall?
Clementine saw
in front of her own house.
Right, so Clementine, had a house right a block off of where the trench was being built, and after her husband Harry died, the houses starting to get demolished for the freeway. So, and we also know that while they're living there, they're deciding where to put 35W. So, just very interesting to me that the times and places where they lived, because they were very instructive to what I consider a very important history about South Minneapolis.
What was your kind of moment of, I don't know, either, I'm trying to, as a producer, right, you're trying to put together a product that people might want to listen to or consume. Was there a moment as you were going through Eric's project, this pet project, where you said, okay, that's it, we got it? Did you have one of those kind of aha moments, Melissa?
Yeah, I think when I realized that her house was one house away from the freeway, I was like, are you kidding me, right? Like, she had been in this neighborhood that they were, I don't know, I don't want to ascribe motivation, but trying to integrate, right? Trying to live where they wanted to live in Kingfield. And then they lost that in the Depression, like so many Black families did. And they sort of, what's the word? They show you what happened to the whole community. They were so emblematic, I think is the word. So then they moved to the Old South Side. And then the Old South Side, they moved down to the freeway, I think, before the freeway came. But their migration followed the migration of the Black community in the Old South Side. And it was incredible to realize that they really are this story.
I often tell people, I always credit Melissa for making this a compelling podcast, because if I had made the podcast, it would have been like every little detail that I had found, because everything was interesting to me, right? And so in many ways, it was a perfect sort of meeting of two different minds, because it was important for me to find everything interesting, because like we needed to have the menu of options. And then Melissa was a bit, ruthless is too much, but you would be like, that is, we're not using that, but thanks for telling me, or whatever. Because there was a lot, we had more than we ended up using. But I think sometimes and this was something, so sometimes, two people can make something that one person couldn't have made alone. And that really spoke to me when we were making this project.
I just want to see, if anyone has any questions, a reminder, raise your hand. I'm going to go to a question right here. Wait for the microphone here, and just introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Dr. Vanessa. Oh, wait. Do I have to push
No, you're good. Keep going. We could hear you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Vanessa Dayton. I have so many questions. I need to talk to you afterwards. But what really struck me, two different things struck me. First of all, I have come to believe in the last many years of my life that the difference between Minnesota and other places is that most Minnesotans are able to admit when they are wrong. Maybe because we've all been through AA or something. But no, sorry. Admit when we were wrong, and own it, and do something about it. That's more typical of Minnesota. And the classic example is George Floyd versus Elijah McClain in Colorado, Aurora, Colorado, where, just a, gainfully employed young man was walking home from the grocery store and beaten to death by police officers because he was black. And the police officers shared videos of them doing it from their body cams on a Facebook page for 2 years before anybody had the courage to, bring it up, and everybody got off. And this is Minnesota, where Minnesotans owned this. Okay, they owned George Floyd, and his image is all over the world because we had the courage to own it, because we're Minnesotans. So now speak to Kansas City, which you brought up, and Truce Street, where that the Republicans in Missouri are redistricting so they can satisfy our current president, who clearly has some kind of issue with people of color, and that's his issue with the Affordable Care Act, as far as I'm concerned. And he's gotten the state of Missouri to redistrict right
so is that
down
your question
True Street.
about it? So the question is about
So how can we migrate ownership of U.S. history to the rest of the country when, what about the Smithsonian? Let's help me.
Eric, you actually did a lot of traveling actually as well to jump off of that. And you went to Missouri, I think to Indiana as well. So you part of this was a journey to find from whence they came.
Yeah, and Missouri, I've been to Missouri now, to Plattsburgh, Missouri specifically, where Clementine's, it's right next to Clementine's hometown. Clementine's hometown is actually underwater. It's under Smithville Lake, north of Kansas City. And it's interesting to me, you drive, you get on 35 and drive for 6 hours, and you're in Missouri, which is a former slave state, and the history that we were grappling with down there with the folks in Plattsburgh who were so kind and generous to us, but was about, it was a different history than what Minnesota had. And yet there were sort of, we were drawing links about, well, Clementine came here, and, there's a lot of Kansas City to Minnesota connection. And the folks in Missouri, we could talk at length about Missouri, but like even the fact that Mecca, Missouri is underwater is sort of a bit of a tale of sort of what happened in Missouri.
Well, how would those to what was just talked about here, how were the conversations even different when you were talking to people in Minnesota versus in a place like Missouri or Indiana?
Well, in one way, I feel like there are people in this town, for example, who they are very aware of the fact that the white folks, some of these white folks in town know that their ancestors were slave owners, and then there are black folks in town, their ancestors were slaves, and those slave owners own those slaves. So they know this about their shared history. And it's interesting because they have to sort of confront it on a daily basis. Some of them are a bit more sort of open about it than others, but it's, Gwen Green down there would tell me, we have sort of shared blood, or we have the same blood, something like that. And one thing, about this town, there's a statue of David Rice Atchison in front of the courthouse, and David Rice Atchison was not only a slave owner, but went into Kansas to try to make sure they had slavery in Kansas during the I think they call it the Troubles, or I'm going to get
Bloody Kansas.
Right, Bloody Kansas.
Yeah.
And so, this statue is, and it's sort of a symbol of some of this history down that they're still grappling with, and it makes some people down there very uncomfortable. And so it's very, it's interesting. Some of them have had to deal with very hard history, and they know certain things about what happened in this town and obviously it's a bit of a different history than Minnesota's history, but it's not that far away. It's one of these border states, and
We just released a bonus episode early last week that was about people coming together to raise money for a headstone for Clementine Robinson. And we talked to Mr. Benjamin here and his class, and I also talked to a woman who works at Blake School. And what they both exemplify in the podcast is the foundation you need in order to hear this history and deal with it in a real way and not let it sink you and not have you take it personally. We didn't ask for this. We inherited this. How do we enter into the conversation like that? And then what do we do next? And Mr. Benjamin's class, Mr. Benjamin himself, I'm totally putting you on the spot here.
Let's bring a mic over. I'm assuming your first name is not Mr. So let's grab a microphone. Could you just give us an introduction of what your class's connection to this story is?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jason Benjamin. I'm a fourth grade teacher at Burroughs Community School in Minneapolis. And there's a little bit of a story. I just want to say Eric Roper was very nice. I communicated him with an email, and he came into the class and gave a little presentation to 9 and 10-year-olds. And they were sitting on the carpet amazed for 45 minutes listening to that story. Anyways, as the year went on, we talked about different things. We read some books that connected to housing discrimination, and we used the Mapping Prejudice website map to look at our neighborhood. Our neighborhood is southwest Minneapolis, and it's predominantly white. Our school is predominantly white. And why is that? Well, there's a history there. And so we kind of found that out. We did some discussions, etc. And then, there were some action steps to be taken. And so later in that year, there was a GoFundMe page to purchase the headstone for Clementine Robinson. And I asked the students, hey, we have an opportunity here. Do you want to help raise some money? And then, of course, they're like, yeah. And so we just asked for some loose change. And we were able to take some action steps and raise some money to help fund the headstone, which was what you were saying, Melissa. It's important to know hard history, and the kids want to know hard history because they want to know if things have been unfair, and they really want to know that. But it's important to give them an avenue, or give people an avenue hey, we can do something about it. And a headstone is nice, and it was very nice, but there's obviously a lot more that we can do. And so, yeah.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I was just, as you were speaking, I believe that children have an orientation towards justice and are looking for fairness and all the things, and it's humans and adults, right? We corrupt their minds. But I also think that that's some of the tension that perhaps sits with this depolarization. Lots of things are polarizing, but this depolarization around history and what do we do with it, and the reckoning that one has. And we're in a moment where there's a faction of society saying that you don't have to carry the weight of history. You can abandon it. And the harm that it actually does, because we know that history repeats and it rhymes. And so it's not about you actually feeling guilt, right? Or you having to shoulder what someone else did. That's not what the unearthing of this is about. It's actually to tell that story so that we can actually start the world building, right? Exercise that's necessary so that we don't repeat it. And I think that that's the beautiful platform. And when we get down into these binaries, we miss this wonderful message that you've known your role in this is as a journalist, both of your roles, is to provide the platform. And I say you've done enough. You've provided the platform and given visibility to something that now allows someone like me in an organization to say, wait, we can turn that pain into promise. And I think that that's what's beautiful about this exchange up here.
What is, when you think about Groundbreak in terms of, and I don't know to whatever extent you're using the phraseology of calling it, for example, a Groundbreak home or a Groundbreak loan, but like, what is different about the product? Like, you were talking about down payment assistance. I believe the loan itself might actually be slightly different, or maybe I'm misunderstanding how some of that works. So like there are actually different financial products that are in the market now as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So as it relates to homeownership, it's two $25,000 essentially grants that are giving. One is forgivable, and it releases 5 years for the first 5 years. And then the other one is essentially paid back at sale if you were to sell. But if you stay in it for 30 years, then we're technically saying that it's yours. We're not going to come ask you for the $25,000. But what is also the uniqueness of that? I think the other thing is the flexibility of the resources. And so sometimes on down payment assistance funds, it can only go to driving down cost and other things. And what we've learned is that particularly on Black people's journey in here to owning a home, it's been about debit and credit. And so being able to source that, it is housing affordability as a key factor in that. So the flexibility and an ability to be able to use those resources that then opens up the pathway to home ownership. And what we're seeing is that it's a first time home buyers product. And what is also beautiful is that we're working with a coalition of institutions that you all know, Habitat for Humanity, PPL, and others in our community, to be able to originate these loans, Build Wealth Minnesota. And they are also now developing a product on the back end for like post-purchase support, because one furnace go down, right? You're kind of back in that cycle. And so reserving some of those resources for a rainy day fund for that provides more stability. So it's all about that level of creativity. And frankly, you get there by just asking people what they need and centering that as the solution that I think unearths the most creativity.
Why don't you think something like this was available 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Maybe a version of it was. I don't know.
Well, I think a credit to us collectively that have been working in the space of trying to get people in homeownership. I think we've seen an unprecedented. We saw that out of the 22, 23, whatever biennium that was, where we see massive investments into down payment assistance into housing. I think we poured a couple of $2 billion as a state collectively into that work. We've seen people, again, try to go at this really from institution to institution or incrementally. And then I think as we become smarter around what are the actual tools that actually help people, then I think we need to be able to meet that moment with the same creativity on the other side of that. And so is a part that feels different.
Eric, what did you learn from the Robinsons as people?
As people,
just what is if they were alive today and you could visit with them, what would you want to know more about them and what they did?
I think first of all, one thing I've always wanted to know more about is sort of the day-to-day interactions in my neighborhood. We have a protest meeting going on 5 blocks away. What is that? Sort of, I'm almost positive Clementine and Harry would have been taking the same walk I do to the bus on Nicollet Avenue or something like that. Like, what is happening as they're doing that? What is, their neighbors? Are they getting invited anywhere? I mean, what is something that you can't find in the old newspapers, or is this sort of day-to-day cultural question? Because I think it would have been. I have theories about how unpleasant it was, but I don't know all the answers. And I think as far as what they taught me, it's like we've talked a lot here about sort of the broad themes of race in Minneapolis, and their lives were for me sort of like, okay, well let's sort of test the theme, or let's see what their lives teach us about that theme. And they really spoke to things that people were saying. They spoke to things like what Mapping Prejudice was talking about. They spoke to things like about the generational wealth issues that people had brought up. And so that to me was very notable, that their lives were instructive in that way. I also think, they had a lot of barriers, but they were both entrepreneurs, and I think that was significant. I mean, Harry, he had gotten this law school scholarship when he was a valedictorian of his high school class in Indiana, and then it was taken away from him because he was black. But then he becomes a waiter, but he doesn't stay a waiter. He opens a restaurant, right? Clementine ends up working at a hospital, but seems to also go into private practice as a massage therapist. And so I think that drive is really interesting to me, the motivation they had. I mean, in 1921, Clementine Robinson and Lena Smith, who's a famous name in Minneapolis history, and I think two or three other women found the Business Women's Club. They're sort of putting a stake in the sand to say we are entrepreneurial business women. And so I think there's something really notable about them and their drive, because Harry opened his own business on Lake and Lindale, and so anyway, that's something that stands out to me.
I believe also, and Melissa, I can't remember if you were part of these conversations either, but in communication, as this story came out, as the podcast came out, you have had conversations, for example, in the Black community, and some of the feedback you're getting is that, well, this is a good story, but it's not unique in so many ways. Talk about that, Melissa.
Yeah, I think it's the first 4 minutes of the podcast. There's a woman named Sharita's like, this isn't the only story. Let me tell you a story, So absolutely, yeah.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I think there are many more stories like this to tell. And, even one of the things when we had our launch event at Sabathani, one thing that was said to us from the audience was, how do we document more of this history? We had some folks in the audience who were in their 90s. So one thing we tried to do, or we did do, was to do a number of oral histories in the last year or less than a year. There are so many stories out there that we at least need to get documented, because like when we think about the oral histories that we relied upon in Ghost of a Chance that were done in the 70s for the most part, that is invaluable, right? I mean, we cannot talk to someone today for the most part who was an adult in the 20s who can tell you about what that was like. And so I think that it's very important to keep telling these stories and to keep sort of finding them in our communities, because they're really important to sort of keep messaging around.
Going back to that woman, Sharita, she talks about how her father would stay up, sleep on the couch with a shotgun, and they'd get hate mail when they bought their home. But she also then said, but then we had a neighbor who was white who said, we're not having that. And I'm always curious about those stories, as we hear a lot about resistance in this period of time. Who were the allies? I mean, when Harry and Clementine bought their second home that ended up a house away from the freeway, there was a white family who co-signed that home. They wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. Like, who are those people? Not to be like, oh, there are good white people, but like, who are those people? And what community were they a part of? And what were they thinking? And I'm really curious about those stories too.
I believe, and I can't remember, Eric, if it was just for this special section or if it was in the paper too, but you actually then went back and wrote obituaries.
Right.
For each, Harry Robinson, Clementine Robinson, when they died, were not people who, in the eyes of the editors of the newspapers, would have warranted an obituary.
They got obituaries in the Spokesman Recorder. They had small little notices. I believe both of them had small little notices in the Tribune or the Star or the Tribune. But we wanted to sort of do, our modern version of those things. And we were just talking a second ago about how this, for the opening of Clementine's obituary, I actually talked about the sort of the massage process a bit more, because this was her livelihood. This is what she did. And the lead of that obituary is she worked wonders with her hands. She was, and it talks about sort of the tension that she was relieving versus the tension she was feeling walking in her own neighborhood. I mean, it was interesting to sort of occupy her head a little bit and try to explore that. I think obituaries are a really meaningful exercise as a reporter, because it's a challenge to try to summarize someone's life and think about in this case, I knew enough about some of the key moments or occupations or, threads in their lives that we could tease out some of the most important pieces for obituaries. And so I found it to be a really rewarding exercise. It kind of came at the very end of this project, and just to think more about them and their lives. And so those ran in a special section and online.
Were you going to add something, Adair, or you were just taking it all in? Well, think about when, in the future, however many years in the future, when all of our obituaries have all been read, Adair, when you think about this moment, and someone like Eric, who is trying to cram too many details into a story, and he's got a coworker who says, we got to take out most of that. What do you think, what do you think, or what do you hope the story will be that we're telling at that future podcast, or whatever counts as a podcast in the future?
About me?
About this work, about this story, about the continuation of this story that you've told us a chapter of Minneapolis history, and we're writing a chapter of Minneapolis history right now.
Actually, I think, Melissa, you've framed it up as like, I think we've all had to perhaps, or will have to answer the question of like, what did you do? And so I hope the story is that you weren't on the sideline, and that you use the platform that you have, whatever that may be. And so if you're a journalist, you tell the story, and if you have the resources, you actually deploy it in a way that makes our communities better. Whatever that platform is that you will do it, and that your name will be written in one of action around the things that need solving in our community.
Do we have any final questions in our last minutes here? I want to see if anyone else has anything else they'd like to ask the folks here. A truly Minnesotan crowd here, not wanting to... Paul over there. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, Shannon Lemon. And I think my question really is around, there was this conversation around owning this work. And while Clementine and Mr. Robinson did what they could to navigate, my question is, who really owns the work? And as we carry this forward, what is the audience that should be partaking in this discussion and coming up with the action plans and reflecting? And it will always be the community of the Robinsons that get to be part of the work, but who really should be doing the work?
Thoughts? Any of you?
I don't know. I'll take a shot at it. I mean, I think that, I think we, in the process of making this, tried to, bring in community to get feedback as we were doing it, particularly people in the Black community from the Old South Side and others. I think that as we, now that we've done the headstone, I mean, I want to keep that momentum. It's hard to sort of put a fine point on, okay, well, what does that mean and what do you do? And maybe I'm not answering the question. I mean, I think that like I have found in speaking about this that there is a lot of interest in, I think there's a lot of interest in sort of, for example, bridging the freeway and having more discussion across the freeway. And yeah, I'm talking in circles a little bit. I mean, what do you think, Melissa?
I can help you.
Okay.
Maybe. I mean, there's so many answers to that question. I think one is who owns the work. I think everybody can take ownership of the work. I love what you said about find your gift, use your platform, do your part. I think the Black community needs to be centered in terms of here's what we need. I think, Adair, what I hear you talking about is like we've realized what some of the barriers are because we've talked to people, we've listened to people. I think that's really key. And for the white community and multi-class white community, again, everybody has a role to play. And I really do look at Jason Benjamin, not Mr. Benjamin, and people who have figured out, like, how do I take this in, and how do I live with this, and how do I make decisions in almost a meditative way, but not being paralyzed by it. So all of those, I think, kind of fit into the answer for me anyway.
Any other questions here? I'm going to end on a note about the gravestone, which has been alluded to, but at some point in this process, you're telling this story, but you realize there isn't. Just kind of quickly tell the story of how you even knew where she was buried, whether there was just kind of go through that story about getting to what you recently had was this lovely little ceremony.
So I moved in the house March 2020. It's kind of about when this process began. And then for some reason, all these years later, it was not until May of 2023 that I said, well, I should probably go and figure out I knew where she was buried, but I hadn't gone there. I think it was because we had created this as a project to some degree at that point. And I went on their shared birthday of May 2nd. Well, they were born in 1881, but and I forget what birthday it was going to be. And I remember taping in the car saying, okay, I'm here at Crystal Lake Cemetery. I don't know what I'm going to find. And the cemetery had sort of laid out sort of a flag for me. And I when I found it, I was actually with a photographer, and I realized that there was not a marker. And it was sort of a bit of a build up to a somewhat of a disappointment. I mean, or at least sort of maybe it wasn't. Was it surprising? I don't know. I expected maybe I would find something, and I did not find anything. And when we started to produce the podcast, and this would come up because it was in episode 6, we had an idea that this would we were going to be involved somehow in doing this gravestone, this headstone. And it wasn't long after the podcast came out that people started to reach out to us and say, how do we donate money to a headstone? And I got a group together, Greg McMore, Bill Wells, and Lisa Crawford, and extra credit to Lisa Crawford, who sort of became her organization, Southside back in the day, was how we ran the fundraiser. We created this GoFundMe and raised $5,000, and a portion of that went to the headstone. We also helped with some other expenses related to people traveling here and other things. And we had family come from Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Iowa. These were great-grand-nieces and great-grand-nephews who had not heard of Clementine before. And we had this it was one of the warmest October days I can remember. If you remember that early October, it almost got to 90 degrees, and the family members unveiled the headstone. And it's really remarkable. I've never been involved in creating something that's bronze and is going to live in the ground for hundreds of years before. And it looks amazing. I was I had stressed out a lot, as Mary Jo and Melissa can attest to. It was very stressful to put the final signature on the design of the headstone, but it's really nice that it's there and that we have that. That Clementine's memory is in a physical space in a cemetery, and people can go and see it. I just had someone send me a picture the other day that he was a listener and he was an early interested donor into this, and he couldn't make it for the unveiling, but then he and his daughter went, and there's a picture of him smiling in front of the headstone. It really meant something to him to have that completed, and so it was a really nice way to honor Clementine's memory. I'm glad we were able to get it done.
There's a whole team of folks here from the Star Tribune. Give us a wave here, and so please continue the conversation with them after this event. And Adair is here as well, and especially for our fund holders, Groundbreak is something that the Minneapolis Foundation is also very involved with. So you can talk to Adair, and I'm going to ask Paul. You had a couple final things you were going to talk about here as we come to a close. So
sure, please give one more hand for Eric, Melissa, Adair, and Tom. Thank you very much. Appreciate your story. I think that it's just a remarkable testament to the question about how do you get active or who owns the work. I think there's great opportunity, and remarkable journalism can change people's minds. So we need to lift that up and celebrate it and support it. And when we have shoulders and bandwidth, like the Minneapolis Foundation, we need to stand up for others. As a fiscal sponsor for Groundbreak Coalition, as a fiscal sponsor for the Star Tribune's journalism efforts that are working in the nonprofit realm. So we have a lot of opportunity here. There's a couple of key takeaways to stay activated, right? Number one, if you want to learn about your home or this history, Ted Hathaway is maybe...
Yeah, where's Ted?
He...
Special Collections at this building is an amazing resource for that. Sorry to
No, that's
interrupt you.
thank you.
Yeah, Ted runs Special Collections.
That's right. So he was here. If you want to learn more about your area, where you live and what your home's history is and all that, it's a remarkable resource. For those of you that are fund holders, you have a philanthropic advisor here that's willing to work, advocate, connect you to causes, bring you closer to areas that you can impact. Please utilize your philanthropic advisor. I am one of them, but you are not my people, so I can just hug you freely. Finally, there's a couple opportunities for you can make gifts to help shape journalism. You can make gifts to help change the trajectory of home ownership in this region. And you have a lot of resources around you and people that you can talk to. So I hope that we stay in community, grab a beverage, finish the shrimp, enjoy yourselves. I'm really grateful that you're all here, and thank you very much to the Star Tribune, to Groundbreak and Adair, to Tom, and to the folks with the Hennepin County Libraries. Have a great night. Travel safely. Happy Thanksgiving.